Hi, everyone. Welcome to this month's episode of Dr. G's Think Tank on Resilience. I am really very much looking forward to this conversation because we're tackling something that, well, to be honest, makes people mad. Most people think about their jobs in terms of me. How does this affect me? Am I successful? Do people care about me? But when you're in a leadership position of any kind, even if you're not at the top of the org chart, you are trying to balance the mission and needs of the organization with the needs of the people. And the binary idea that you only care about one is silly. I want to say outdated, but actually, I'm not sure it was really ever the case in most reasonable organizations, even if we went back hundreds of years. So, since leaders are not caricatures, and employees are not only self-interested, everybody needs to think about this balance. I am so glad to have with me today people who have navigated this, whether they've thought about it every day or not, have navigated this for a lot of their careers by advising leadership, by being a part of how companies run. I'd like to start by introducing Diane Schwartz. Diane is the CEO of Reagan Communications, a leading media and training company that serves communicators and marketers worldwide with education, networking, and unparalleled event experiences that I have been lucky enough to be a part of. Diane joined Reagan in 2019 after serving for 23 years at Access Intelligence, where she was Senior VP of the Media Communications Division and oversaw the growth of major brands. She's a former journalist, a frequent guest lecturers at universities nationwide, a board member of the Institute for Public Relations, and a founding member of CHIEF. If you don't know what that is, look it up. It's pretty cool. Diane, hi. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Dr. G. Thanks for having me.
Diane, in your experience, when do you most often see the good of a company come into conflict with the resilience of its employees?
I would say right now is a good example of that, where we are dealing with a lot of headwinds in the marketplace, which is impacting, of course, most businesses. And so therefore, there's change and there's a need to pivot, and there's a little bit of getting uncomfortable, like some new things that we're doing. So I'd say we want to keep at least as the head of the company, I want to keep our employees motivated, feeling safe and secure. At the same time, there are expectations around change. So I would say, resilience really comes into play during times of major transformational change, whether it's internally or external.
But the point that I take from you is that sometimes when that comes into conflict, it's through change that is absolutely not the fault or choice of the leadership within the organization.
Correct. But
Okay.
it still feels uncomfortable.
No question. No
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Okay. Terrific. Now let me please introduce Kirsten Graham. Kirsten is Vice President of IBMer Communications at IBM. She's an experienced communication leader who's worked in a range of industries and roles focused on stakeholders, including employees, media, clients, IT industry analysts. At IBM, she leads a team of internal and executive communication professionals charged with enabling a global workforce of, wait for it, 270,000 employees, and they call themselves IBMers. The IBMer communications team is aligned to the company's strategy. That's what's good for the company piece, and operates at scale to support its growth while also focusing on enhancing the IBMer experience. I think you can see why I thought Kirsten had probably given some thought to this particular tension. Kirsten, hi, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I'd like to ask you, when do you most often see the good of the company come into conflict with the resilience of the?
So this is common, exactly what Diane said. It's common, I think, at every company, no matter the size. We have a huge company, but no matter the size, when there is a hard decision that's made that impacts the company, the change, whatever that change is, can feel very disruptive and feel disruptive to employees and can very much impact resilience. It's asking people to do something that feels so uncomfortable suddenly and getting used to that idea.
And we'll probably talk a little bit about it, but I think that often uncomfortable in our gut translates to this must be wrong in our brains.
Potentially, yep.
Okay, our next guest. David Brown is the president of D. Brown Management, an advisory firm dedicated to helping contractors build stronger businesses for the next generation. David began his career in 1988 as an apprentice electrician and progressed through various positions, including foreman, superintendent, and project manager, before moving into executive management. Today, along with the strong team he's developed at his company, he serves clients nationwide, advising them, training them, coaching them. I met David through his work with one of his clients, and he has been a true mentor to me. David, hi, thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this discussion. You know, I'm a little bit different than most people when it comes to stress, so this is going to be kind of cool.
I do think you're a little bit different. And I think that because of your role advising, if I'm not mistaken, advising people who are usually really at the top of the org chart, right, you may well see this a little bit more strongly through the management lens. And so I really want to hear that honest opinion. And I hope that because you're not, representing your own company as much in this, you'll be able to be really honest with us about why sometimes maybe feelings don't have to matter as much as we think they do, or something like that. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah.
I'd like to start by asking you, when do you most often see the good of a company come into conflict with the resilience of the employees?
I think where we see it the most is when, and this I look at a company level and at a country level, probably any organization, but it going from good to great, or making a bigger strategic change that is required but not necessarily apparent to a lot of people because things either are good or appear to be very good. That's where there's usually a lot of difficulty, where the resilience comes into play because it brings up all the fear. Now, when I look at it though, when there's actual real external existential level threats, everybody tends to rise up, and there's actually no resilience challenges whatsoever. That's why I keep the World War II poster, behind me as a reminder that, when we're faced with true problems, everybody rises up, and there's actually very little problem working through it.
That's
So
really
that's
interesting because in Kirsten and Diane, some of your answer, the word that came for me was disruption, right? And often those disruptions come from outside, dis being sort of against or out of alignment. And Dave, what you're talking about is totally aligned, going from good to great. And so I do want us to think about, as a group, when is it more challenging maybe to say we're making the hard decisions that Kirsten spoke about in order to level up, not just understandably in response to a pandemic or a financial crisis in the world that everybody can be like, oh, no choice, right? That was imposed upon us. That maybe it actually is harder when you're like, yeah, we are pretty good. Things are fine. We're just not willing to stay at fine. And that's why we're making these hard decisions. Is that, so I'm going to ask you, Kristen, because you're a communicator, is that harder to communicate to people in ways that make them feel okay?
Yeah, I think it definitely is, because everyone has a different interpretation of what it means to say going from good to great. If you feel like you're doing pretty well right now, then you might push back and go, I feel like things are fine. Why are you pushing me to be better? Why do I have to go faster? Why do I have to be, what's this perfection we're looking for? I saw something recently that was talking about the difference in communicating with people about AI, for instance, and how a lot of companies get very focused on things like productivity and speed and efficiency. And that can feel like something uncomfortable to employees, because you're telling me I'm not fast enough, I'm not efficient enough, I'm not.
You'd prefer a robot, right? You'd prefer someone with robotic speed. Right. You don't like or care that I'm a person.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it could feel like. The way that they're talking about presenting it instead, for instance, was talk about how using AI is a chance to build your skills, enhance your capabilities, make yourself more valuable in the marketplace, be, better at your job, but at all jobs. You're a person who is very adept at this technology. and it's less puts less confrontational, less puts you less on the defense. So it's just one side of things, I think.
That makes sense to me. So, Dave, I want to take it as a given in this conversation that leaders do care about their employees, right? Whether or not
Yes.
that's always felt by the employee, whether or not they care to the exclusion of all else, I wouldn't take as a given. And I kind of hope it isn't to the exclusion of all else, or else you'll have good friends, but no company. But so, given that I do think that most leaders understand that focusing on the good of their employees matters, I want to ask you first this central question we're going to try and answer today. How can leaders build health and resilience in individual team members and still stay locked in on business success?
Boy, okay. So I'll hit a couple macro answers and then there's some micro answers to it. I think one of them is designing the organization correctly. And I think about the organization like gears in a transmission, and everybody runs at different speeds. All the gears in your transmission run at different speeds, but they all work together so that the whole machine runs. And so you're not overclocking anybody. There's a whole tier in the organization. No, they don't wake up in the morning. They want to wake up in the morning and do a good job, but they're not the ones that are waking up saying, I want to climb this mountain every single day and I want to do this and I want to, inoculate myself from stress and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. They deserve to have a tier of management that is looking after them, that is stretching them, that is developing them, that maybe has a 50% gap. And you kind of work that all the way up where one of the places where we see the biggest challenge is when you have somebody, and there's kind of a selection bias that people gravitate towards the top of the organization that, want to wake up every day, eat change for breakfast and love to run faster just because. And so they move to the top of the organization and they think everybody should be like that. That's just categorically not true. And everybody's at a different stage in their journey. Everybody needs to be communicated to differently. And those are usually in tiers. There's an individualization aspect to it, but there's also tiers to it. And I look at those tiers like gears. And if you don't design your organizational structure right and your communication structure and your management system is aligned with that, that's where the problems start to begin.
So a leader has an obligation because nobody sits down and says, I want to have a company, I can hire 100 people and I want to arrange it this way. They start with their farm team and they grow it and grow it and grow it. And so you're saying you can't just let people fall accidentally into different tiers and roles. You have to really think about their strengths, their interests, their focus,
Yeah.
and place people for this purpose into different speeds.
Absolutely. And where they're at just in a stage of life. Like I might be, I might have, X capabilities, but then I've got these Y circumstances at home. Maybe I'm taking care of a sick parent or something like that that totally changes my dynamics for a period of time. And that period of time might be months, it might be, several years, but if you're building for the long term, you have to take all those things into account as you design your organizational structure. And at the same time, that organizational structure management systems can't let the customer, the outcome has to be the same, but you have to take the individuals into account.
Okay, great. Did you have another macro or micro thing you wanted to mention before I bug someone else?
I think the only other macro is the leaders this starts with self. Again, always to that Rumi quote of, what it was, yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I'm wise, so I'm changing myself. So leaders doing the work on themselves, like the ones that have truly done the work on themselves, that's where it begins. Because that's a hard journey. And when you start looking in the mirror every day, you realize it's not a straight line and it's difficult as can be.
Can you give a couple of sentences if a leader comes to you and they say, "Hey, I heard you say this on this think tank. Where do I start? What does that even mean? Doing the work on myself."
So then, would get into starting to ask, we start with an inventory, right? Of, where are they? What have they done? But also, do they have any challenges whatsoever? A lot of times with a management team where we're starting, we do start by having people, almost like data point gathering of, how are the check-in meetings, how are you feeling, what are you doing? And we actually force people to write that down. So it's kind of like forcing journaling if that's not already a habit. And then you start to realize, like, a lot of times conditions don't change whatsoever, but feelings do. So you start to realize, like, who's more subject to their feelings, who's aware of those feelings, who's comfortable communicating them, and who's just living in them.
So you're
So
strengthening
that's
people's
probably one
emotional
place where you start.
intelligence, and you're asking them when you face challenges to first look at what's my role in this, not what do I
Yeah,
wish I could hire somebody who would magically not have any of these things. What's my role in?
100%. Because I think
Okay,
all change starts from within.
that makes sense to me. That's really helpful. Diane, could you speak to this bigger question in your own organization? But if you would also let us into your wisdom, because you work with people who are in or near the C-suite of so many organizations. And so I'm interested in your observations and your thoughts, without naming any names, of course, as to your answer to this question. Like, what have you seen leaders do well? What goes wrong in building health and resilience in their individual team members, while still staying locked in on being successful as a company?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, sort of the baseline here, is when we think about 5 generations in the workplace, and a lot of the younger generations that are in the workplace now, it's like the struggle is almost normalized. There's always change. I mean, since COVID, and then social justice issues, we have AI, we have the current geopolitical issues. They're just used to constant, external factors impacting the marketplace. And maybe as leaders, we don't give them enough credit for being resilient. That we talk there, we need to, as leaders, sort of understand. Well, first of all, I think most people are tuned into the WIFM channel, like the what's in it for me. So as we talk to people and mentor and lead people, I mean, end of the day, we're all like this. I think it's like no one's immune from this. You're kind of thinking how this particular change is impacting me. I mean, we see that across the spectrum, no matter how large or small your company is. Since we are working with a lot of communicators, I mean, we are of the mind that a lack of communication really erodes trust and resilience. And Kirsten knows this because we know each other there in the communication space. And leaders who don't communicate often and clearly, and with clarity and trusting their employees, they won't get the trust back from their employees.
Okay.
And so if an employee does not trust you as a leader, they won't trust the company. It impacts the brand. It impacts their productivity and their tenure there, possibly. So I think that communication and the instilling trust in employees, and the clarity also around, I mean, KPIs. I don't know how many of those on this call work with KPIs and being very clear about the business goals and the person's personal goals and achievements. But I think when there's lack of clarity on what the goals are, both personally and the company goals, and aligning the two, that's when there can be a breakdown.
Okay, I want to drill down a little bit more for those of us who are not communication professionals. And Kirsten, you're welcome to answer this as well. But Diane, you mentioned, for the opposite of lack of or poor communication, you mentioned frequency, right? You want to be in communication often, have clarity so that it's not a muddled, I read that email and I don't even know what they're telling me.
Right.
And then you talked about trust. So I can write often. That's a metric I understand. I can try to write clearly, have somebody else read it. Do you understand what I was trying to say? Feed it back to me. Building trust with communication, though, in addition to honesty, not saying something you know to not be true, what are the other ingredients for a leader to, because I agree with your basic premise is really obvious to me once you've said it, that to build the resilience of individual people while keeping your eye on the ball for the company, you have to have clear communication. You have to have good communication, but I'm trying to really be specific about what good means. So in addition to honesty, are there other things I should keep in mind as a leader when I'm communicating to build trust?
I believe vulnerability is
Okay.
one thing that really resonates with most employees, making yourself vulnerable as a leader. David, I'm sure you work with the clients around that. And sometimes it's, it could falsely send a signal to employees that, oh, this leader is afraid of what's going on or whatever. But again, going back to trust your employees and they'll trust you. If you show a little vulnerability, I think it goes a long way. And it even feels better as a leader. I know for me, it feels better to share than to hold back. So that's, there's some companies that can't share everything out. Well, most companies can't. Leaders shouldn't share everything, right?
But honesty and transparency are not identical, right? So being totally transparent is not necessary to being honest or building trust. So that part doesn't confuse me.
The other, part is if you say you're going to do something, you have to do it. Or if you're not going to do it, you have to explain why we're not doing this or you're not doing this. I think that's where it also erodes when you promise something and it doesn't happen and then you lose the trust.
That makes sense to me as well, right? You're going to live by your promises or die by them in terms of trust.
And it works, personally too, right?
It does.
Personal relationships, yeah.
Kirsten, the reason that I got interested in this topic as it relates to resilience was because of a conversation that you and I had where you were talking to me in general terms about the work that you do to cultivate relationships with people in the teams that you trust and that you very much care about how they're doing. And that when that's in tension in some way with your loyalty to the good of the whole company as a whole and the vast number of employees that are there, that you have to lean towards the company when it's in tension. What advice would you have for somebody who's trying to figure out in a micro way or a macro way how to navigate that situation within their own company? Like when you see that it is in tension, the good of an individual or a small group of individual employees and the good of the company, what should that leader, if they're not maybe the tippy top of the organization, like in hundreds of thousands of employees like you have, what would you recommend that how should they think about it, or what should they do?
Yeah, I think a lot of what Diane just covered, those are like spot on communications recommendations for how we should approach talking to people. Yes, transparency is hard, but there is a point of there is a point to being transparent around vulnerability, around here's what I can talk about and here's what I'm not going to be able to share with you. Candor, it goes a long way as a leader in terms of here's where I'm coming from. Here's the things that I think that you can take action on that are going to make you have some agency over what you want to do with this information. I think it's really important at the company level and at every leader within the company at their level as well to be having frequent conversations about the company's strategy, its goals, its intentions, and the expectations that come from that. And that's like very frequent. And when we say frequent, it's like, companies I've worked for, it's all the time. It's every conversation that you're having with someone about their career should also reflect, things about the company's strategy so that they can understand this is where we're headed. And this is where I see you having some opportunities. And if this doesn't sound right to you, then let's explore the way that, it's going to make you more comfortable where you're headed. It might not be this company. It might be a different part of this company. It might be, there's a lot of conversations that you can have, but I think it is in terms of like other opportunities, but I also think I agree with David and with Diane, there's generational aspects to this too, where people, I have kids who are Gen Z in their 20s, and I agree with Diane. There's a different level of comfort that Gen Z professionals have in the workplace that I didn't see so much before pre-COVID, put it that way. COVID really did change a lot of things, I think, for a lot of people. but just being comfortable with all these things that keep changing, and just being aware of what's happening in a company, asking for feedback. I've never seen such a generation of asking for feedback all the time, which is refreshing, to tell you the truth. And also a little terrifying if you're a leader who's not used to giving feedback or receiving feedback. That can be a challenge.
In the general chat, or do what a couple of you have done and send me a private message with a question as well. Dave, I want to ask you, I'm going to assume that at some point in your career as a consultant, you've had to say to a leader, you've said to a leader, it looks like what you're saying is the direction to go is this, and have the leader feedback to you in some way, oh, my people wouldn't like it. Or, there'd be pushback, and that they are hesitant to act, even though they might agree with you that it would be best for the company, that they're really hesitant to pull that trigger because of the pushback that they would get. If I'm that leader, what advice do you give me in that moment? What truth telling do you do?
I think I'll say a couple of things. I mean, for where we work with companies at is almost always a good to great. If they happen to fall into a problem while we're working with them, we're obviously down for that fight. But that's where we don't do turnarounds, and so we run into this kind of challenge that I initially described quite a bit, and even to the point of all these quote unquote things that are going on today. These aren't quite existential threats. I mean, and I think it's important for people to differentiate that. So back to the leaders though that bring that up and say, okay, my people aren't going to go agree with me. A lot of times when we use just the tools of like, okay, let's go talk about specifically who. Let's pull up the org chart. Let's talk about who. Let's talk about the history. Most of the time we're working as just a lot of questioning, and almost like a damper, works in a skyscraper to keep it from falling over in an earthquake. So sometimes leaders want to move too quickly, and it's like, okay, respect the past, respect the legacy. The organization may not be ready for that level of change, and so you're slowing them down a little bit. Other times you need some help speeding them up. And most of the times when we're at that decision point level, whether something happens in the next month or the next 24 months isn't going to change the 5-year outcome, if that makes sense. So that's, so a lot of it's just getting somebody to calm down, recognize that they have decision time, what their decision timeline is, and then really working through the individuals. I think it's important to get them very emotionally comfortable with it, and knowing that they're going to for us, it's super important knowing they're going to treat the people right. I love people. Now, it doesn't mean all people are right for all roles and all organizations, but I love all people equally, if that makes sense.
And I really like what you're implying there, which is that leaders shouldn't hear slow down as no.
Right.
That those aren't the same things. And that I know of organizations that I've been lucky enough to work with where there's somebody who the good they've done for the company is being the like, wait to their visionary leader. And then when the visionary leader is like, no, now we have to jump, they're like, well, I'm going to have to fire that person who says no, when that slowdown or that no has been super valuable up until then. And maybe we just need to think about it a little differently and use it as the guardrail that it is, that it's not an obstacle, it's a guardrail, sort of keeping you on the road.
To me, if you miss as a leader on, with something, if you miss by forcing a change too quickly and you alienate others in the organization, it takes you years to recover from that. So slowing down by a few months and over communicating to the point of where people are like, hurry up, Dave, make the stupid decision. That's almost like the point where you want to get to, is where your people are telling you, hurry up, Dave, make the stupid decision and we'll go.
You're making Diane and Kristen so happy by saying over communicate, because they might disagree that there is such a thing. Diane.
Yeah. I was gonna say I use that word intentionally because there probably isn't a such thing as over communication, but it always makes people stop and pause and think about it and go, well, what does that actually look like? What would over communicating look like? And I think Peter Lencioni described it well. He said, like, when your people are doing, making caricatures of you and making fun of you in good light, that's when you've communicated enough.
Diane, you said something, and we got a question in from the group about it. You talked about how, and I totally agree with you, that our younger folks in the workplace have been through so much change that they are maybe less shocked by it, right? They may not love it, but they may not like a particular change or another, but they do see it more as the status quo. But this person's question is that same group of people seems to demand, is the word they used, more support and more care, personal individual care to navigate that change, which can be, they said, can outstrip the capacity of the group. I'm putting together two questions. Somebody said it can outstrip the capacity of what the company can provide. So how do you navigate that? Like, you don't disagree that they need support, but they're asking for so much feedback, to Kirsten's point, so much almost coddling for some people.
Yeah.
They want so much hand-holding
Mhm.
that even though it's great that they're used to this, they're also really used to saying, and I require this. Do you have any suggestions in that situation?
It makes me think of boundaries, and that we all, as managers, not just as the leaders, but the managers on the front lines that you need, that are really closer to the employees. There's the leader at the top, and then there's layers, right? And then, that manager, that line manager, that probably has even more employees reporting to him or her. Setting those boundaries, I think around the 2020 time period, we were also, engaged in a lot of therapy at work. And
like it or not,
and there were expectations, unfair expectations. We were all doing our best. I feel like for a while, I'm like, oh, I feel like a therapist. I think we all felt that way. And we felt good that we were helping people, but we're really not equipped to do that, most of us.
Well, because literally every time you said, how are you? You got a very deep, real answer for 2021.
Yes. Yes. And then that, again, normalizing certain behaviors, I think it's I see a change in that expectation. There were like 2 or 3 years where there was a lot. I mean, we should be empathetic leaders, but employees shouldn't expect us to be their therapists. There should be support and collaboration, positive reinforcement, but we also have to be fair, and we have to give honest feedback. And one phrase we haven't used yet that I think that ties into all this is the idea of psychological safety for employees. And I think the more that employees feel that they can contribute to the discourse, and it's not just this top-down edict, this is what we're doing, but they have a say in things, I think also makes them feel happier, safer, more productive, less needy, perhaps, because they're more accountable, because they're helping to come up with the ideas rather than just being told what to do.
You just made me realize, I think that might be a whole other episode of the think tank, is really diving into that idea of psychological safety, what it is, whose responsibility it is. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that. I want to spend a little bit of time summarizing some of the things I've heard, and I welcome your feedback about it. I think where we started by talking about how disruption that comes from outside is definitely a time where it can put the good of the organization in tension with the needs of the individuals who are there. But to Dave's point, I think it's absolutely true that when that obstacle is great, our community, belonging, connections grow, and we're likely to navigate that moment pretty well, to see where we fit into the bigger picture, why we should all pull together and metaphorically plug the hole in the bottom of the ship so it doesn't sink. That one of the bigger challenges is when the need for change isn't as globally obvious to everyone in the country, in the company. In the country actually is a reasonable slip, but the need for change isn't inherent to everyone. Meaning the opportunity for change, like I get what you're going for there, but do we really have to, makes it harder for people to be resilient when they feel like this is like AI in a lot of circumstances, putting them on the defensive, or is maybe going to show them, maybe they're afraid it's going to show them to be less necessary in their role, or be expected to do more when they feel like they're already at capacity. So that good to great changes can be harder on individuals in the company. I heard over and over again the idea that we have to align, right? To really the strategies we can use where we are going to focus on the good of the company, but we also not but and we also care about and want to move forward with building our individual teams and team members. Diane, what you pointed out about making sure that our KPIs for our professional goals and the workplace goals don't completely eclipse talking about and understanding that professionals' goals in their own career and, to Dave's point, their capacity professionally, but their availability as a three-dimensional human and what's going on with them and all the other aspects of their life and how those interact. And the couple of things we can do as leaders are figure out where those KPIs and those personal, and I don't mean personal outside of work, I mean individual goals are aligned. But another thing is to remember that that equation of capabilities and capacity, capabilities usually just grow, capacity fluctuates. So if this is a who, a person, and there's a great book by Mort Mandel, it starts with who, is that if this is a who that you probably want to keep given any opportunity to keep them, then we look for ways, like you mentioned, Kirsten, to figure out, given your current capacity and our capacity, our needs as a company, where do you fit right now? Because we're invested in you, but we're not necessarily invested in you as the assistant sales supervisor. We're invested in you. And I'm hoping you're not just invested in our company as the assistant sales supervisor. I'm hoping you're invested and aligned with our company because of the relationship between the two. Those are really helpful. Some really crucial points that came up in our conversation about communication. I really like the word candor, because I can't tell you from individual parents to leaders of companies how many times I've had the honesty versus transparency conversation. And candor is a better word, Kirsten. Thank you for that, because candor doesn't imply that I will tell you every single thing that's happening in my mind or might happen or that I talked about in a meeting. Candor is, I'm going to be upfront and factual with you about what I can say, what I can't, and the why behind it. That's really useful. Also, over communicating, to Dave's point, to the point where people want to roast you for it, and communicating in a way that's clear to them, not just to you. I write a weekly email, and for people who are with us today that read it, I talked last week about the curse of being an over-explainer. And that often my over-explaining does not make me more clear. It just makes me feel better. And so making sure that I'm clear to the receiver, or, in your case, Kirsten, the receivers in the tens of thousands or more, that's what the clarity piece is. Building trust. And Dave, I think the advice that you gave us about designing the organization intentionally is also a piece of this trust, like the long game of trust and the short-term trust, being vulnerable, asking for feedback, doing what you say you'll do or explaining why you're not. Those pieces are really useful. The last thing I want to point out is that, Dave, you actually gave us sort of a physics definition, right? Velocity is speed and direction. And that equation, that as when you've got the direction correct as a leader, a place you can give a little bit is on the speed. Your velocity is still aiming in the correct direction and it will still propel you there. But if you can dampen the speed a little bit, that builds trust. That builds resilience in individual team members. That is less likely to break things while you're going from good to great. Yeah, I really appreciate all of those. You like that velocity idea?
Well, I was going to say on that one, usually when we see somebody projecting it out, you get the spreadsheet jockeys, and I'm one of them. I love spreadsheets. There's nothing that can't be done on a spreadsheet. But usually a projection of growth, looks more like a linear growth curve. In reality, it's usually a lot more jagged, but looks closer to a power curve. Meaning that you're going to go a lot slower in the beginning. That's where that saying, I guess, all overnight success takes 10 to 15 years comes from. That's really hard to think about for that person that built the linear business model. and is going, well, we missed our targets next year. It's like, yeah, you're not going to miss your targets every 10. You will miss your 10-year target, but by much better, by much higher. So I think that's an important concept for most people to get their heads around, but hard to feel.
It is, but it is, I think, one of the essential answers we've come to today with this question of how can leaders build the resilience and strength of their team members while still keeping locked in on business success. And that is to think more strategically about direction and let speed take second place, right? Be more cautious with speed. If you've got your direction, then it's okay to go a little slower because that brings everyone along a little bit more safely. And to that psychological safety piece, Diane, you're never suggesting that for the psychological safety of my employees, I'd say, okay, we won't add that new division to meet that new market need. You're saying, how can we add that new division, meet that new market need while keeping people feeling like this boat isn't rocking quite as much as I thought it would, and maybe I am still okay being here on deck. Before we end, I would like to ask each of you a strategy question. And Kirsten, I'm going to start with you. What's the most successful intervention or a successful intervention you've seen in proving to employees that their leadership really does care about them?
So this is not a like game changer, but I've seen it be very successful in an employee having the chance to meet with a leader, but a leader that's directly aligned with their part of the business. So if I'm a manager, not meeting with me, their manager, meeting with my manager, giving them a chance to do this skip level type of conversations. Yeah. So that you're having, it's a different conversation because the leader's not so very involved in the day-to-day work that the employee's doing. They know of them, they know what's happening, but they can have a more philosophical discussion with them about careers, about opportunities, about other places to, get some experiences, about mentors. They can have all those types of conversations that a manager would be a little more confined. I found it to be very successful. It usually brings people back who are just like energized, who feel like, wow, this person took an interest in what I want to do. They really appreciated where I was coming from, and I feel like it was a good conversation. So
that's awesome. Thank you for that suggestion. Dave, how about you? What's an intervention you've seen be really successful?
Yeah, one, I love the skip level piece. So that one's definitely there. I wouldn't have said that as a first, but as you were talking, I was really thinking about how many times that's incredibly valuable because the manager once removed can see things with a distance. And also it tells you where the organization's at if you have pushback from the managers or weirdness with the employee meeting with a manager once or twice removed. So that's a really cool one. I'd say the big ones, the relationship, it's the small things, like the really, really small things. It's like Brene Brown talks about building trust. And building trust is not in the big moments. It's in a whole series of really small, consistent moments. So just something small, like there's someone I work with, and she's new to an executive team at a client. She's doing an amazing job of building rapport with the top 30, 35 people. A lot of it is small as it seems. She's working on strategy, and yet, her strategy for building relationships is knowing everybody's coffee order and making sure that it's right. So she's like, are you a barista or are you an executive? Which one is it? Is there a difference? Probably not, but it's so funny. I mean, people are more enthralled with her coffee orders and her remembering those little arcane details than they are with, some of the strategies that she's putting together, which are brilliant. So it's just interesting dynamic.
That's great nature. Because that's something that you can consider at any size organization. Okay, right. Diane.
Yeah, I would just piggyback on that with, the small, consistent actions and, listening and then the follow up. If you're just listening, it can be a little performative in a way as a leader if you're not following up. And so listening for the cues, like following up with training, if they're saying, I really want, I really need more training in XYZ, or if they mention something personal, that they're really looking forward to doing, maybe sending them a gift certificate of some sort, or, there's so many things you can do for them personally, beyond coffee is a great thing that always works. So I think when somebody says, wow, how did you remember that? That really shows that you are a good listener, and, that goes such a long way. And it makes working with people more fun,
It does.
even as leaders.
I
Yeah.
want to point out, and I'm so grateful, no one said cornhole and an ice truck, right? So these ideas of like, we're going to have a happy hour, we're going to get everybody or a whole group of people together to do one thing, and that's going to help everyone. I'm really glad that we're looking at this instead as what teachers would call differentiated, right? So instead of differentiated education, this is differentiated support, really seeing that person and giving them something that would be useful and valuable to them. It's like me saying that I'm going to communicate in ways that the receiver it's clear to them, not that it's clear to me. And I really want to take that away as a great leadership reminder today. Thank you all for your time and for your attention. And thanks to the people who are here with us and the people who catch this on the replay. And next month on the Think Tank, May 27th, we're going to talk about figuring out what opportunities are collaboration and what are competition, and how to have the resilience to pursue whichever it turns out to be. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.